groups often militarize the communities around them and block access to humanitarian assistance. Women, young women, girls are often targeted in particular to armed violence, aggression, and trafficking. They're the victims. Often law-based order collapses in those situations. Human trafficking, arms trafficking, and illicit economies based on violence proliferate. The proliferation of weapons also undermines trust in government and creates major crises.
The availability of small arms prolongs violence, making conflicts deadlier and harder to resolve. When disarmament and reintegration programs fail to account for gendered realities, such as the reintegration of women ex-combatants or the protection of women's rights defenders, violence resurges, often exacerbated by the illegal trade of arms. Even after conflicts formally end, peace remains fragile with weapons and when weapons continue to circulate. The presence of armed groups leads to increasing political violence and the targeted killings of women in leadership and increased risk of sexual violence, whether they are politicians, activists, or peace builders. Malgré ces réalités,
in spite of this reality, disarmament policies are often not linked to promoting gender equality and fighting gender-based violence. This must change. Arms trafficking should be addressed to create the necessary framework for protecting women and children. States must make sure that the export of weapons does not lead to diversion, feeding violence against women and other vulnerable groups in the community. And this must be part of the global policies of arms control. Weapons, munitions, small arms and weapons, as well as nuclear weapons, must be addressed by states in their arms control efforts.
Armament colleagues, that promote gender equality, we must do 4 things. 1, integrate women, peace, and security commitments into arms control policies, ensuring that disarmament efforts explicitly consider gendered impacts. 2, prioritize gender-sensitive disarmament and reintegration programs, recognizing the diverse roles of women in conflict and post-conflict settings. 3, strengthen arms trade regulations, ensuring that gender considerations are a key factor in weapon export decisions. And 4, invest in community-led peace building, particularly initiatives led by women and gender diverse peace builders who are directly confronting armed violence. Le désarmement ne se limite pas à la réduction de...
Disarmament is not just reducing the number of weapons. It's about removing pressures that marginalize women and vulnerable groups in the community. If we want to truly build sustainable peace, in addition to military responses, we must protect people who suffer the most. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Katrina, for your excellent presentation. Now let us hear from Ms. Natalie Briggs, who's the Network Coordinator, Gender Equality Network for Small Arms Control, GENSAC. Natalie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, and colleagues. Good morning, and thank you so much for the kind invitation to speak on this panel from the President of the General Assembly, the President of ECOSOC, and UNODA. My name is Natalie Briggs, and I am the Network Coordinator for the Gender Equality Network for Small Arms Control, GENSAC for short, whose secretariat is based out of the NYU Center on International Cooperation. GENSAC is a cross-regional network focused on advancing gender-responsive approaches to small arms control. Members and partners of the network come from the Western Balkans, Latin America and the Caribbean, and Africa, and are primarily women drawn from nonprofits, community-based organizations, the security sector, academia, and international organizations. GenSec serves as a source of knowledge for the small arms and gender equality community and facilitates the participation of its members in global small arms control and development discussions like the one we're having today. We have heard Ambassador Ray speak about the urgency of finding solutions to address conflicts exacerbated by the illicit trafficking of small arms, such as the devastating situation we see playing out in Haiti. Now, let's assess how far we have come, because we have come a long way, and it's important to celebrate this progress in linking gender and disarmament. This will help us see where these solutions lie and how we can take action to further our progress. 30 years ago, it could be said that the field of arms control and disarmament was gender blind. When the UN Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons was adopted in 2001, the only gender-related language included was a reference in its preamble to the disproportionate impact of small arms on women, grouping them together with children and the elderly. Today, there is a greater understanding of how gender dynamics influence armed violence, including how women and girls are differently affected by small arms and how gender norms can fuel militarization. Gendered power dynamics can affect the likelihood of being targeted by small arms violence, prospects of becoming a victor or survivor of armed violence, and even the ability to access medical attention in the aftermath of armed conflict. Research and advocacy have shifted the conversation towards acknowledging these links. We've seen significant milestones in international frameworks. The Arms Trade Treaty, adopted in 2014 and now with 116 state parties, was the first international treaty to explicitly address the link between the arms trade and gender-based violence. In 2018, at the UN Program of Action's third review conference, states made efforts to mainstream gender in the POA. States built on this language in the 7th and 8th Biennial Meeting of States and in the 4th Review Conference just last year. Today, as mentioned by Ambassador Chan, we have a RevCon 4 outcome document that recognizes gender roles, norms, and expectations for women and men to acquire illicit arms. And in the 79th session of the UN General Assembly, the UN adopted 77 resolutions proposed by the First Committee, of which 26 featured gender-related provisions that call for women's equal participation, stress the gendered impacts of weapons and armed violence, and or highlight gender considerations in disarmament efforts. We're also pleased to see that gender has been given due consideration in the new global framework for through-life conventional ammunition management, a closely related and interlinked process to small arms control instruments. Objective 14 focuses on strengthening gender mainstreaming and ensuring the full, equal, meaningful, and effective participation of women in conventional ammunition. Despite the progress I outlined, much work remains to be done. The security sector remains a male-dominated field, and the militarized nature of arms control has hindered the full inclusion of women in disarmament efforts. Over the last 30 years, women's participation has improved, but we are still underrepresented, and I know my fellow panelists will expand upon this more in her own remarks. We're not advocating for inclusivity for its own sake, but the recognition that the unique perspectives of women result in better outcomes for everyone, something we have seen firsthand through the work of GenSec members. For example, in conflict-affected areas of Africa, GenSec members observed that the women in villages were often the first to notice influxes of weapons into their communities as a precursor to surges of violence. In response, GenSec organized dialogues between women in the community, security officials, elected leaders, and other policymakers so they could share the specific ways their communities were at risk of armed violence. This knowledge enabled authorities to improve security policies and presence in the region and to stay ahead of possible violent outbreaks. We must also highlight that linking gender equality and disarmament does not just mean addressing women's issues. It requires engaging men and boys in efforts to prevent and address violence. Societal norms associate masculinity with firearms, reflected in statistics showing that the majority of civilian-owned firearms are held by men, but we can address these harmful norms that drive armed violence and perpetuate gender inequalities. Additionally, even in regions considered to be at peace, women remain at heightened risk, particularly in their homes. This reality underscores the importance of embedding gender considerations into disarmament policies worldwide, not just in conflict zones. And just as international arms control instruments too often lack a gender component, many international development and security agendas, such as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, have yet to fully recognize how advancing gender-responsive small arms control fits within broader aspirations of both building peaceful societies and achieving development goals. We're meeting today during the 69th session of the Commission on the Status of Women, a timely reminder of this critical link. When assessing the state of gender-responsive small arms, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the critical role of civil society organizations. They hold states accountable, advocate for more effective measures, and raise awareness about the devastating impact of illicit arms flows. A wide range of civil society organizations and individual experts have been pivotal in supporting the efforts of states and the United Nations to develop and implement processes like the Program of Action and the Arms Trade Treaty. Through strategic advocacy, civil society can help shape the future of global small arms control and ensure the voices of affected communities are heard in decision-making processes. In order for them to do so, we must provide local and national CSOs with sufficient civic space, information, and financial resources to effectively engage in public oversight and advocacy on small arms issues, including by incorporating their perspective into decisions related to arms control and disarmament. Though the arms trade, small arms control, and ammunition management have life-altering impacts on local communities, discussions regarding these issues are frequently held in far-off cities like New York or Geneva, where it can be difficult to make their voices heard. Finally, while meetings like this are important platforms for dialogue and awareness raising, their impact will be limited without concrete action and sustained financial support from member states. Commitments on paper, no matter how well-intentioned, will not amount to significant progress unless they are backed by real investments in gender-responsive disarmament initiatives and programs. We cannot afford to let these discussions remain in the realm of rhetoric. GenSAC's work demonstrates that when properly applied, this gendered approach to small arms control is more than a talking point. It can save lives and build peace. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Now I'll give the floor to our last panelist for her remarks, Mrs. Hannah Salama. She's a researcher in the Gender and Disarmament Program at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR, and she co-authored the report, Women Managing Weapons, exploring women's participation in weapons and ammunition management. Hannah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Excellencies, Ambassador Chan, distinguished delegates, and fellow panelists. First, I would like to express my gratitude to the President of the General Assembly, Ambassador Philemon Yang, and the President of the Economic and Social Council, Ambassador Bob Ray, for inviting me to be a part of this timely discussion. It's really an honor and a pleasure to share the panel today with my fellow panelists. As some of you may know, the United Nations Institute on Disarmament Research, known as UNIDIR, is a leading institute which supports the UN and its member states on arms control and disarmament issues. We do this by producing evidence-based research and convening stakeholders to promote an inclusive dialogue to try and find creative and effective solutions to today's most critical issues in international security. One of these issues that we focus on is precisely the gendered consequences of armed violence. At UNIDIR's gender program, where I am a researcher, we have produced data and analysis about the impacts of weapons and conflict on women, men, boys, and girls. And today, it's really a pleasure to be here in New York to be able to share some of our findings and also our ideas about how gender-responsive arms control can be implemented by member states. Over the last few years, UNIDIR has been conducting research looking at the interlinkages between the illicit proliferation of small arms and light weapons and gender-based violence, and more specifically in conflict related to conflict-related sexual violence, where at the beginning of this session today, Ambassador Ray mentioned that 95% of survivors and victims of this kind of violence are women and girls. In our 2023 report, which you can find on our website, we found that the proliferation of small arms and light weapons in conflict can be linked to sexual violence in two main ways. First, directly, as weapons and ammunition are used by perpetrators to commit rape, threaten, and coerce individuals into sexual acts against their will, injure or kill survivors and victims. And secondly, indirectly, as weapons proliferations contributes to fueling conflict, and this in turn propagates the conditions that lead to sexual violence or other types of gender-based violence in a conflict and a non-conflict setting. On the direct links, in fact, there is very limited data. It's not something that is routinely collected, weapons in conflict-related sexual violence incidents. But through consulting various actors, such as hospitals dealing with survivors of this type of violations, NGOs and international organizations that operate in conflict settings, we were able to obtain data for 6 conflicts. And these are the DRC, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Sudan, South Sudan, and Ukraine. And in those places, between 70 to 90% of incidents of sexual violence have involved firearms. Now, this data is from 2022, but we will be updating it soon. But as many panelists has mentioned, we know that weapons are not only used in conflict, they're also used in non-conflict settings. For example, firearms are responsible for 45% of violent deaths, and most of these violent deaths actually occur in non-conflict settings. While men constitute the majority of victims that are perpetrated by firearm, it's true to say that women are disproportionately affected by homicidal violence in the home. According to the UNODC's latest report on gender-related killings, women represent approximately 53% of all victims who were killed in their homes, and 66% of all victims that were killed as a result of intimate partner violence. In addition to killing and injuring women in their homes, the use of small arms can also facilitate different types of non-lethal violence, as we discussed sexual violence or domestic violence, but their use also limits the rights of women and children. And specifically, the OHCHR has reported that it can limit their right to education, free movement, participation in public and political life, and this contributes to exacerbating gender inequality. So what can states do to prevent these impacts? I think that's the question on everybody's mind. And states may wish to leverage gender responsive arms control, but what does that mean in the real world? So in our view, this means mainly 3 things. The first is that states should consider ratifying and implementing international arms control and instruments related to small arms. As we heard from my fellow panelists, these instruments, such as the UN Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, the Arms Trade Treaty, the Global Framework on Through-Life Ammunition, already recognize the role that the proliferation of small arms and light weapons play in gender-based violence and including sexual violence in conflict. But not only do they recognize the role, they have measures and obligations in the case of ATT to prevent gender-based violence. So for example, in the case of the ATT, they do have an obligation to conduct a risk assessment on whether arms exports could be used to facilitate gender-based violence. And in the POA and the UN and the Global Framework on Through-Life Ammunition Management, these instruments outline considerations for states to take. For example, collect sex and gender disaggregated data on the impacts of firearms or ammunition and ammunition diversion, and this would help states to better inform legislation and policy on small arms. Taking together, these instruments are key in stemming the illicit proliferation of weapons and effectively reducing access of weapons to potential perpetrators of gender-based violence. The second action that states could take is at a multilateral level. As mentioned in contexts such as Haiti, states can mandate UN peace operations to use arms control measures to prevent sexual violence and gender-based violence in their contexts. UNIDIR's upcoming research has found that UN peace operations are in a unique position to leverage tools such as disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, known as DDR, weapons and ammunition management, WAM, and community violence reduction and arms embargo are effectively implemented and cross-leveraged to stem the proliferation of weapons as a driver and enabler of sexual and gender-based violence. States can ensure that these peace operations have clear mandates linking arms control measures to the prevention of sexual violence and gender-based violence, and also allocate financial and human resource capacity to capacity building activities. UNIDIR's research showed that there's been actually little awareness by our UN peace operations on the grounds about the linkages between weapons and gender-based violence. And there's a need to enhance data collection, disaggregated not only by gender, but also by weapon type, and share this information in a timely way to enhance early warning and prevention strategies. And lastly, I think most of my panelists have mentioned this, but states need to continue to work on promoting women's participation in arms control and disarmament, decision-making, and implementation at all levels, and especially at the national level. Because in addition to shaping the impacts of weapons, gender has shaped the way the international community works together to develop and implement policy and legal responses to weapons proliferation. Just to take us back a moment, UNIDIR's research has shown that in multilateral forums dealing with weapons, women still only comprise of a third of diplomats. And this is not because that there isn't any diplomats available. The proportion is in stark contrast with other areas of diplomacy, such as human rights, where women are still 50-50 or comprise 50% of diplomats. And when it comes to leadership position, the gender imbalances are even more pronounced. On average, only 25% of delegations are headed by women in arms control and disarmament forums. So in view of all this, I think it's clear that discrimination and violence against women is pervasive. And it's not a small problem that only occurs in pockets of society. Rather, it's a global problem. More is clearly needed to be done to tackle the issue, and I'm really encouraged to see Canada and Cameroon taking the lead and chairing this debate. Your leadership is most welcome. And UNIDIR, as always, stands to support your delegations and all other member states in their efforts to achieve a more just and secure world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I now open the floor for comments, questions, and statements. There is no pre-established list of speakers. Please press the button to request the floor. Limit your statements to 3 minutes when speaking in your national capacity and 5 minutes when speaking on behalf of groups. Delegations may also submit their full-length written statements through e-statements@un.org, which will be posted under e-statements of the UN Journal. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Guatemala, followed by Egypt and South Africa. Guatemala.
I begin by thanking the presidents of the General Assembly and ECOSOC for organizing this discussion. We thank the panelists for their briefings, and we also thank Ambassador Maritza Chan for moderating this panel. For Guatemala, the equitable, meaningful, and effective participation of women at all levels, including in leadership roles as agents of change and of peace, is extremely important. My country is proud that currently the Vice Ministry for the Prevention of Violence and Crime is headed up by a woman. The Vice Minister, Maida de Leon, has fantastic experience that has enabled her to establish links with domestic and international entities to strengthen state security and justice systems. Through her leadership, Guatemala is beginning the process for its national plan of action for the implementation of the Central American Program of Action and the Dominican Republic for the prevention of the trafficking and the proliferation of firearms, ammunitions, and explosives, the one that was adopted on the 12th of February last. We're aware of how important it is to ramp up efforts to achieve gender equality, the participation of women, and the empowerment of all women and girls, including in the areas of disarmament and arms control, as was agreed in the Pact for the Future. In a global context marked by multiple armed conflicts, the participation of women is not only a right, but it is also an essential condition for achieving lasting peace. This has been demonstrated through experience in processes that include women. These turn out to be more sustainable, lasting, and effective, with a higher rate of implementation of the agreements reached. On the other hand, we're also concerned about the effects of armed violence, in particular the effects of the trafficking of small arms and light weapons, in addition to conventional ammunitions on women and girls. We must commit to continue to work to improve the compiling of disaggregated and understandable data in national contexts. This will enable us to channel our approaches towards the eradication of gender-based violence. Lastly, if I may, I'd like to reiterate Guatemala's commitment to continue to ensure the full participation of women in decision-making processes, in particular in the areas of defense, security, and peace building. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Guatemala, says the chair.
Egypt, followed by South Africa and Australia. Egypt.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Allow me first to stress that the negative impact of illicit trade in small arms and light weapons is unquestionable. However, we believe that there is a need to address the matter in a holistic approach that takes into consideration the following 4 points. First, the legitimate security needs of states and the right for self-defense is imperative as well. Second, the root causes of conflicts and the regional contexts provide important impetus for understanding these crises at hand. Third, it will be useful as well if similar discussions on the impact of increased expenditures on nuclear armament on development is convened as well, besides the impact of small arms and light weapons. Fourth and last, there is a responsibility that should be shouldered by developed states, which is effective international cooperation and capacity building. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Egypt. Over to South Africa, followed by Australia and Cuba. South Africa.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to the panelists. We would like to make the following 5 points. One, the theme of our discussion today, we believe, includes 3 key considerations of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. That is participation or representation, prevention and protection. Secondly, South Africa remains a firm supporter of the equal, full and effective participation of women, including in leadership roles and decision-making structures, in all policy, planning and implementation processes, mechanisms and fora related to the field of arms control and disarmament, which is currently, unfortunately, dominated by men. Legal frameworks for arms control and disarmament are critical tools of prevention, such as the Arms Trade Treaty, as pointed out by some of the panelists, which addresses the importance of responsible trade in conventional arms and gender-based violence in its Article 7.4. As a state party to the ATT, we believe that this treaty adequately guides states on how to mitigate the use of conventional arms for harmful purposes, including gender-based violence and armed violence. Fourthly, we believe in the collective need to address the illicit trade not only in conflict zones, but as it relates to crime in all its forms. Fifth and lastly, South Africa acknowledges that there are other mechanisms on conventional arms control and disarmament. Therefore, there is value in creating linkages between the various mechanisms to assist member states with their implementation of obligations, which could facilitate and strengthen confidence building on arms control as a whole. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa for her statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Australia, followed by Cuba and Colombia.
Thank you, and thank you to the presidents of the General Assembly and ECOSOC for convening this discussion today, and to Ambassador Chan and our panelists for this very important discussion. Australia supports gender-responsive small arms control as a means of reducing their use in the perpetration of violence against women and girls. Small arms are frequently used to perpetrate sexual and gender-based violence and femicide. Therefore, limiting access to these weapons and reducing their circulation can enhance the safety and security of women and girls in their communities. In order to eliminate gender-based violence, we must address the root causes of gender inequality. This includes addressing patriarchal systems which disempower and discriminate against women and girls and foster harmful gender norms, such as violent aspects of traditional masculinity. Australia is committed to advancing gender equality and the protection and promotion of the rights of women and girls, including persons with disability, at home and through international engagement. In early 2024, Australia released our first ever national strategy for gender equality, Working for Women, a strategy for gender equality. Australia's national plan to end violence against women and children sets out actions towards ending violence against women and children in Australia in one generation through prevention, early intervention, provision of support services, and legal reforms and support for recovery and healing. Australia also supports the transformative potential of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. It is simply not possible to achieve lasting peace, stability and prosperity without its full implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Australia. Now, the floor to distinguished representative of Cuba, followed by Colombia and Indonesia. Cuba.
Gracias, moderadora.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, distinguished Chair, colleagues. The illicit trafficking of small arms and light weapons and their consequences require commitments from all member states. We're in favour of discussions on this being held within the framework of the Programme of Action to prevent, combat and eradicate the illicit trafficking of these arms, which is a useful benchmark on this issue. The SDGs are indivisible and must be adopted comprehensively within the framework of the platform of specific mandates for this. We believe that violence caused by armed criminal groups must be addressed from the perspective of criminal justice under the leadership of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, the UN ODC, and the corresponding international regimes. Interpersonal violence, including domestic violence, must continue to be addressed in the social, cultural, educational, and economic and criminal justice areas, taking account of the individual characteristics of each country. To eradicate the trafficking of small arms and light weapons, it's necessary to address its root causes. We require genuine international cooperation for developing countries by strengthening capacities, by providing technical and financial support, and the transfer of equipment, materials, and technology in order to contribute to national efforts to fight against this scourge without any conditions attached. Double standards have no place when it comes to the flow of weapons feeding conflicts or empowering transnational organized crime. It's essential to put an end to the deviation and transfer of these weapons to non-authorized actors through illegal trafficking. The main arms producers, in particular the United States, must assume their responsibilities and show political will and stop obstructing explicit prohibitions in this regard. Global military expenditure is increasing in a staggering way. A lot of resources are allocated to the perfectioning and improvement of nuclear arsenals, increasing the risk of an arms race, and military expenditure could instead be reallocated to the economic and social development of developing countries. For example, NATO's budget alone could enable the commitments, financial commitments to climate change of the most polluting nations to be achieved. There's the development of the Programme of Action of the International Conference on the Relationship between Disarmament and Development, and the measures adopted every year in the NAM movement. Thank you. Now Colombia, followed by Indonesia and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Thank you very much, Ambassador Chan. The relationship between small arms and light weapons and gender violence is undeniable. In many contexts, these weapons do not only perpetuate conflicts, but they also provide for structures of violence that disproportionately affect women and girls. Addressing gender-based violence requires concrete action that includes arms control and preventing armed violence. Colombia has assumed this commitment in a sincere manner. Our security, defense, and peaceful coexistence program includes a gender approach that addresses the differentiated impact of armed violence on women and girls. Furthermore, the sectoral project on gender mainstreaming in public policies has enabled gender policies nationally, strengthening the participation of women and providing protection for them in the security area. International cooperation here is crucial. Resolution 1325 of the Security Council was fundamental in Colombia's efforts for enabling the participation of women in peace and disarmament processes. In negotiating the 2016 peace agreement, women represented more than 60% of the victims' delegations and 50% of the delegations from the national government. More recently, the National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security 2024 to 2034, established with the participation of more than 1,500 women, is strengthening our country's commitment to an inclusive and sustainable peace. However, challenges still persist. The proliferation of illicit weapons facilitates the territorial control of criminal groups, people trafficking, and increases gender-based violence. Multilateral fora must strengthen the provision of disaggregated data on this phenomenon. Furthermore, the United Nations must continue to promote the participation of civil society and women's organizations in the establishment of disarmament policies. In this regard, I would like to ask a question to Natalie, our panelist Natalie. In fact, two questions. The first question, could you share with us other examples, successful examples of how arms control works in practice with a gender perspective? And the second question is, what can we do to incentivize member states to engage in arms control policies with a transformative gender perspective? Thank you. Thank you, Colombia.
The distinguished representative of Indonesia, followed by the Democratic Republic of the Congo and El Salvador.
Thank you, Ambassador. I thank the presidents of the General Assembly and the ECOSOC for convening this meeting, and the panelists for their presentation. Indonesia welcomes this important discussion and underscores the need for stronger synergies across UN bodies in addressing various cross-cutting issues, including between small arms and light weapons control, gender-responsive policies, and sustainable development. Indonesia remains committed to implementing fundamental principles of arms control within its national development framework, recognizing that effective regulation of small arms and light weapons is essential for stability and economic progress. However, we continue to see major challenges, including weak governance, regulatory loopholes, porous border control, and shortages in capacity, which undermines this effort. As Ambassador Wallace highlighted in the previous panel, that addressing these challenges require action at national, regional, and global levels. And Indonesia, with a maritime area spanning 5.8 square kilometers, border control is a key priority for our country. It is why we emphasize regional cooperation, including through ASEAN's Plan of Action to Combat Transnational Crime from 2016 to 2026, which includes enhanced intelligence sharing, improved border security, and enhancing marking and tracing systems to disrupt illicit arms flow. Another area that my delegation wishes to highlight is that the ongoing crisis in development financing will have impact on our cooperation in this subject. The latest UNCTAD study concluded a $4 billion drop in global development funding in 2024, and the situation is likely to deteriorate further this year. In this context, I would like to pose this question as well to the panelists. How do we ensure the sustainability of international commitments and ensure the effective implementation of the outcomes of the fourth review conference of the POA on small arms and light weapons, particularly on technical capacity building and the mainstreaming of gender perspective policies in prevention of small arms and light weapons? The interlinkages between these issues are the reason why we need to look at this matter in a comprehensive manner. And we appreciate that the convening of this meeting to enable us to break the silos in addressing peace, security, and development issues. Indonesia looks forward to discussions on concrete measures to strengthen financial commitments and also technical support for small arms and light weapons control. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Indonesia. I now give the floor to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, followed by El Salvador and Latvia.
Merci.
Thank you. Madam Moderator. As a result of the uncontrolled proliferation of small weapons, Africa is vulnerable to organized crime, violence, undermining peace and stability. The Democratic Republic of the Congo has suffered military aggression on the part of Rwanda, undermining our economy and peace. We've been victimized by armed groups, causing a dire need for national consensus and response. Women and children are disproportionately affected by this violence. 90% of gender-based violence is linked to uncontrolled flow of small arms and light weapons. Since 2023, 100,000 cases of gender-based violence have been recorded. In 24, this violence further increased, mostly affecting women and girls. And in the first months of this year, these numbers have increased further. More than 900 cases of rape have been recorded in the first 2 months of the year. The government has taken a number of measures in terms of enforcing existing law in the area of possession of arms, control of small arms and light weapons, preventing their proliferation in cooperation with multinational institutions, destruction of illicit weapons, integration of disarmament programs with community development and stabilization, particularly preventing the flow of arms between armed groups and civilians, and prosecution of individuals involved based on our policy to protect the population, particularly its most vulnerable segments. However, none of these measures will be truly effective without concerted action at the international level, which is why we call for strengthening international cooperation, integrating arms control within national strategies, assistance to affected states, involving young people and vulnerable groups of the population in these efforts, and pursuing arms control as part of development strategies, because there's no sustainable development without stability. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to El Salvador, followed by Latvia and the Association Manoa for Human Rights and Immigration. El Salvador, tiene usted la palabra.
El Salvador, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Ambassador Chan, distinguished panelists. Thank you for your contributions. El Salvador wishes to underscore two fundamental issues. First of all, the differentiated impact of arms violence on women, girls, men, boys, children. El Salvador is in favor of the development of public policies and more focused and effective strategies to fight against armed violence. That's why it's essential to advance in the compilation and standardization of disaggregated data to ensure that public policies can precisely respond to the realities of each group of the population and thus strengthen security for citizens. The second aspect is the need to strengthen disarmament policies focused on gender, ensuring the active participation of women in decision-making on disarmament, arms control, and peace building. It's essential to strengthen regulatory frameworks in order to prevent the use of arms in all forms of violence, and in this framework we call for engaging in synergies with other key agendas such as the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and the Youth, Peace and Security Agenda. Finally, when it comes to the context of humanitarian crises and conflict zones, we reaffirm that the presence of small arms and light weapons, their parts, components and ammunitions aggravate the vulnerabilities and make it more difficult to provide humanitarian assistance. In places like Haiti, the uncontrolled circulation of light weapons has exacerbated the security situation and has enabled armed groups to be strengthened and increase their control on the state. The population faces critical levels of violence, forced displacement, and restrictions on their access to essential services. We wish to therefore ask the panelists how we can ensure that we address the impact of the proliferation of small arms and light weapons in their connection to alarming levels of sexual violence that we're seeing in conflict situations. Thank you.
Floor to Latvia, followed by the Association Manoa for Human Rights and Immigration, and India. Latvia.
Thank you, Ambassador. Latvia welcomes this joint meeting. We thank the organizers as well as the speakers for this thought-provoking discussion. Illicit proliferation of small arms and their misuse has devastating effects on our collective ability to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, including those related to gender equality. Latvia has been actively supporting efforts aimed at addressing this issue. As a member of the Bureau of Fprrd Review Conference on Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons last year, ably chaired by our moderator, Ambassador Maritza Chan of Costa Rica, we were pleased that the outcome document indeed acknowledged that adverse illicit small arms and light weapons is a crucial matter in our efforts to achieve gender equality. And looking forward, we believe that as we contemplate the peace-building architecture review this year, prevention should also take into account small arms and light weapons as an important factor that needs to be addressed. And finally, I would like to ask a couple of questions, particularly to Ms. Catherine Leclerc. And those would be, first, the WPS agenda and arms control are often seen as separate policy tracks. So how can we better integrate gender considerations into disarmament and arms control policies? Then what role do women peace builders and civil society organizations play in disarmament efforts, and what challenges do they face? And finally, what concrete policy recommendations would you make to governments and international organizations to address the intersection of small arms control and the WPS agenda? I thank you.
Thank you very much, Latvia. I now give the floor to the Association Manoa for Human Rights and then India.
السيدات والسادة نشكر الأمم المتحدة والمجلس الاقتصادي والاجتماعي على
Ladies and gentlemen, we are thankful to ECOSOC and the General Assembly for convening this important meeting. We're talking about the proliferation of small arms and light weapons creating havoc in our countries and leading, among other things, to gender-based violence, targeting civilian population and infrastructure, undermining peace and stability in the region and the freedom of navigation. We demand the enforcement of Resolution 1216, promoting international cooperation, working with legitimate governments for peace and sustainable development. We condemn the violence imposed on our population by recent bombing and Houthi attacks against unarmed civilians in cities and villages. Peace and sustainable development in Yemen are inconceivable without stopping the proliferation of deadly weapons and ensuring the safety and security of civilians. based on international law. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our last speaker of the day will be India. There are 19 speakers waiting, and I kindly ask you to submit your statements to e-statements so we can have a record of them. India, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, for giving me the floor. India welcomes this important discussion on the impact of small arms and light weapons on security, sustainable development, and gender equality. The proliferation of SLW remains a significant threat to peace and security, fueling conflict, organized crime, and terrorism, while also undermining governance and development efforts. Cross-border terrorism remains a particular concern for India, as the illicit flow of SLW across borders fuels instability and threatens regional peace and security. An integrated approach to SLW management requires addressing both security and developmental dimensions. India believes that 5 key elements are critical for effective SLW control. First, national ownership through strong legislation and political commitment. Second, a standardized organizational structure for coordinated action. Third, effective data management for real-time tracing and accountability. Fourth, risk management to prevent diversion and misuse. And fifth, security protocols and deterrence measures to strengthen border controls and stockpile management. India's national database of arms and ammunition armed license issue system is an example of effective data management, improving oversight and reducing the risk of diversion. We recognize that the proliferation of SLW disproportionately impacts women and girls, exacerbating gender-based violence and undermining social stability. India has contributed to increasing women's participation in disarmament by sending Indian women ammunition experts to conduct the first ammunition workshop in Switzerland and to speak at high-level events in New York on women's meaningful participation in ammunition management. This reflects India's commitment to encouraging greater involvement of women in the security sector. India believes the United Nations has a key role in supporting member states through capacity building via UNODA and regional UN organizations such as UNRCPD Kathmandu, digitization assistance for record keeping, and sharing best practices. Strengthening regional coordination hubs can enhance intelligence sharing and operational capacity. India is a strong supporter of the UN Programme of Action on SLW and the International Tracing Instrument. We remain committed to strengthening the role of women in disarmament and preventing gender-based violence through effective arms control. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of India for her statement. I'd like to give 1 minute to our panelists so they can respond to the questions that some of the delegations raised. I can start with Natalie, if you don't mind.
Thank you very much. Gracias, Colombia, por su pregunta.
Thank you, Colombia, for your question.
Examples in practice. I have an excellent example from one of our GenSec members and partners, an organization based in Trinidad and Tobago called the Women's Institute for Alternative Development. And they're implementing a project on women's conversations on sustainable approaches to small arms control and how firearms violence impacts women's security in Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica. And this project is designed to promote and protect women's rights and small arms control initiatives through data collection and gender analysis, and will offer specific recommendations on how to harmonize national policies and action plans on small arms and the WPS agenda. And it also allows insights into the way that small arms move through and within communities and how these become social realities and influence varied forms of insecurity. And then quickly on your other question regarding how to incentivize member states to prioritize gender-responsive arms control policies, I think it's crucial to frame these policies as solutions that address broader political, economic, and security concerns rather than as standalone gender issues. For example, we can showcase how gender-responsive disarmament can lead to more effective violence prevention strategies and strengthen social cohesion, and this can make the case that these approaches benefit overall stability and development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, likewise, for the additional questions. The separation between the women, peace, and security agenda and arms control is a critical issue, as we've mentioned already here today. And arms control and disarmament policies must systematically incorporate the women, peace, and security commitments that are happening in one of the other chambers in this place. One key mechanism is the Arms Trade Treaty, which mandates gender-sensitive risk assessments before arms transfers. However, the implementation remains quite weak, and so we also need disarmament programs that account for gender realities, such as ensuring women ex-combatants receive support in reintegration efforts, strengthening coordination between disarmament mechanisms and women, peace, and security national action plans, for example, which 110 member states have national action plans on women, peace, and security, which is a great step forward. Some of the recommendations that I want to kind of reiterate or add into areas of priority that member states can consider is integrating women, peace, and security into arms control policies, so that governments should align their arms control policies with the women, peace, and security framework, ensuring that disarmament efforts explicitly address gendered impacts, strengthening gender-sensitive risk assessments, so as required by the Arms Trade Treaty, as I've mentioned, but not fully enforced, states must systematically assess the risk of gender-based violence before approving arms transfers. The third, and previous to the final, is to support women-led peace-building initiatives, so funding and political support for grassroots women's organizations, which must be increased and sustained, especially in moments like these. And then improving gender-responsive DDR, as we've heard from our other panelists, and programs responding to disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration from a specific gendered lens.
Thank you for all the statements and the questions. I think I'd like to respond to the question on sustainability of efforts in this difficult time where we're experiencing not only a cut in funding, but also a pushback on the importance of gender equality. So I would say that, back to the basics of joining and also ratifying arms control treaties and instruments, but also reflecting that in national legislation and policy. I think that when the international community is working with national authorities, it should be able to also build capacity on gender responsive budgeting. So eventually, international development funding is not needed, but this budget is coming from the states themselves when it comes to also arms control and disarmament policies and programs. And just also a quick note, if I might add to Katarina's remarks on breaking down the silos, and this is something that UNIDIR has been working on. So in 2020, we looked at national action plans on women, peace, and security, and we saw that only a quarter of them actually mentioned weapons or any weapons-related issues. I think that this picture has changed over the last 5 years, and we will be soon producing a report on how this has changed, but also on practical guidelines and indicators on how to practically measure arms control, or how to practically integrate arms control into WPS national frameworks, how to measure the progress, and how to monitor the programs. So I think this is also an area which we can collaborate on with other partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. As we wrap up this discussion, I want to extend my sincere appreciation to our wonderful panelists for their insightful contributions, and to all of you for actively engaging in this dialogue. The perspectives shared today have also reinforced the urgency of creating policies that truly address the needs of all affected populations. Natalie's intervention highlighted the critical role of civil society in shaping and advancing this agenda. Katrina's and Bo's reflections further emphasized the importance of linking our work to other global frameworks such as the Women, Peace and Security and the Sustainable Development Goals. Hannah's insights made it clear that without gender-responsive approach to disarmament, arms control, and the prevention of armed violence, we will neither achieve gender equality nor effectively reduce arms-related human suffering. The road ahead will not be easy, but I urge you, all of us, to continue working together, ensuring that weapons are taken out of the equation while our collective efforts move forward. Before concluding, I wish to remind delegations that the closing segment will start promptly after the conclusion of panel 2, this panel. Once again, thank you very much. Panel discussion 2 is now concluded.
Well, thank you, colleagues. We will now begin the closing segment of the General Assembly and the Economic and Social Council on small arms and light weapons control for preventing violence and advancing sustainable development. I thank the moderators, panelists, and all of you for your active engagement in these discussions. I also want to thank all of the participants for their insights and contributions to the meeting. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Adediji Igbo, who's the Director and Deputy to the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, to deliver some closing remarks.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished panelists, participants, ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to deliver remarks on behalf of the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, who had to excuse herself moments ago due to unforeseen commitments. It is a pleasure to address you at the closing of today's event, which I have followed with great interest. I wish to start by thanking the President of the General Assembly and the President of ECOSOC for their collaboration in organizing today's important meeting, which reflects cooperation and innovation in addressing global challenges through collective action. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your commitment. And thank you for being such good pioneers in putting together this historical event. I also extend gratitude to the panelists and moderators for sharing their expertise and experiences with us today. To all participants, your engagement today contributes to fulfilling member states' commitments to integrating small arms and light weapons issues into development and prevention frameworks. This aligns with commitments made in the Pact for the Future. The meeting also marks a significant step towards operationalizing the commitments from relevant global frameworks, including the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons and the Global Framework for Through-Life Conventional Ammunition Management. To these discussions clearly underscored why strengthening this link is a priority. Namely, small arms and light weapons control is not merely a short-term remedy for public security concerns, but a long-term investment in social, political, and economic development. To illustrate this point, we know, for example, that achieving progress on Goal 16 of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, namely to reduce illicit arms flows, enables us to make progress on several other goals, including gender equality, education, healthcare, and environmental sustainability. In sum, arms control is a critical measure in preventing and mitigating violence and conflict while advancing sustainable development efforts. Distinguished participants, today's event has provided us with invaluable recommendations that will guide our collective efforts moving forward. Let me highlight some. First, at the UN, we must seize the opportunity to bridge the gap between policy communities. The momentum generated by this joint meeting should serve as a catalyst for advancing more integrated policies to reduce the human cost of weapons. I strongly encourage states to revitalize the First Committee's discussions on the critical relationship between development and disarmament, and prioritize this through the adoption and advancement of the annual resolution on this topic. Another key recommendation we must implement is to integrate small arms and light weapons control measures into national and regional development frameworks as a major tool for promoting stability, fostering sustainable economic growth, and enhancing human security. I call on member states and relevant UN bodies to incorporate arms control issues and measures into common country analysis and the UN Sustainable Development Cooperation frameworks. By embedding small arms control in development strategies, we can better address both immediate and long-term peace-building priorities, ensuring a more cohesive approach that links disarmament, development, and human security. This approach also ensures we consider the particular needs of women and girls who are disproportionately affected by the proliferation of arms, while amplifying the voices of future generations. Third, regional approaches are essential for facilitating cross-border collaboration in both disarmament and development. Regional frameworks, such as regional roadmaps and action plans, can guide the integration of arms control into development strategies, ensuring that national and regional efforts are mutually reinforcing. I encourage member states to collaborate with regional bodies to develop or enhance tailored interventions that integrate disarmament measures into regional development plans, fostering a comprehensive approach to sustainable peace and security across borders. At the national level, a whole of government and human-centered approach is essential for integrating arms control with poverty reduction, employment, and community development. Cross-disciplinary working groups involving government agencies, civil society, community leaders, and international partners are key. So too, forging broad partnerships, particularly with grassroots organizations and civil society at the national level. In this regard, I want to highlight initiatives which support civil society organizations and other stakeholders with quick impact projects aimed at strengthening small arms control, such as the ODA-managed UNSCA Trust Facility. The Saving Lives entity, otherwise known as Salient, is jointly administered by ODA and UNDP and is a key vehicle for developmentalizing small arms control and interlinking these efforts with armed violence reduction and sustainable development at the national level and community levels. We are very grateful for and encouraged by the positive feedback on Salient by the PR of Jamaica, Mr. Wallace, earlier this morning. I call on all member states to enhance or initiate their financial support for the Salient program and to support these desired outcomes. I would like to spend some time on the topic of gender-responsive small arms and light weapons policies, which require collective effort at all levels. I support the recommendations that were put forth at this event, particularly those that underscore the importance of including disarmament efforts into strategies to prevent gender-based violence, protect women in conflict zones, and to empower women as key actors in arms control processes and decision-making. It is essential that diverse voices and needs are heard in both disarmament and development discussions. How do we achieve this? Allow me to share some thoughts. First, we must ensure that data collection systems are inclusive and capable of capturing the gendered impact of small arms and light weapons through disaggregation. Second, we need to enhance diversity and inclusion by addressing the barriers to women's participation in policy making and implementation processes at all levels, including technical levels. Third, it is crucial to address the gender roles and norms associated with weapons proliferation, as these often shape the demand and use of small arms, exacerbating gender-based violence and insecurity. Additionally, integrating disarmament into the broader gender equality and women peace and security agendas is essential to ensuring that arms control efforts contribute to the empowerment of women and the creation of more secure and peaceful societies. Finally, the active and sustained participation of young people in disarmament processes is indispensable for long-term success. Young people must be included at every table, ensuring their voices and perspectives are central to policy discussions. I commend Mona Lisa Hazarika for demonstrating so passionately this morning the importance and legitimacy of the perspectives of youth. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, before we conclude, I would like to highlight a critical issue that has emerged during our discussions and that was spotlighted in the Pact for the Future, and that is the rising global costs of conflict and military expenditures. My office is spearheading a study on this issue as requested by the Pact, and I would encourage ECOSOC and the General Assembly to consider convening a dedicated joint meeting to discuss its findings in the coming months. As we conclude this pioneering meeting, I would like to express my appreciation for the insights shared and the valuable discussions that have taken place. The outcome of today's joint meeting will be captured in a summary prepared by the offices of the President of the General Assembly and the President of ECOSOC, which will highlight the key messages, ideas, and policies that emerged and will serve as a crucial reference point moving forward. I hope that this summary will not only contribute to the discussions at the 2025 High-Level Political Forum on the SDGs, but will also inform and shape future conversations on small arms and light weapons control. The link between disarmament and sustainable development is undeniable. Let us seize this momentum to ensure that arms control continues to be a priority within the global development agenda. Together, we can turn today's discussions into concrete actions that will shape a safer, more sustainable future. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rebo. I thank the Director and Deputy to the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. Thank you so much. I now give the floor to my friend and colleague, His Excellency Philemon Yang, who is President of the General Assembly. Mr. President.
Thank you to all moderators, panelists, and participants for attending today's meeting. As mentioned, our offices will prepare an informal summary of the discussion, which will be circulated to all member states. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The joint informal meeting of the General Assembly and ECOSOC on small arms and light weapons control for preventing violence and advancing sustainable development is now concluded. I'd like to add my personal thanks to all of you and to all the participants. Thank you so much. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you very much.
Ramadan reminds us of universal values that connect humanity.